The Miami sun burned my skin, but it was his gaze that seared through me, unraveling every defense I'd built over years of hiding. I sat at the pool bar, the clink of ice in my glass a weak distraction from the chaos in my chest. Then he sat next to me, uninvited, unapologetic, and dangerously close. His name was Ethan, or so he said when he introduced himself, his voice low and smooth like the bourbon he ordered. I was Caleb, 28, a graphic designer from Chicago who'd fled to this glitzy Miami resort to escape the suffocating expectations of my conservative family. I wasn't here to find anyone. I wasn't here to feel anything. Yet there he was, his broad shoulders brushing mine as he leaned in to comment on the bartender's flair with a cocktail shaker. His laugh was easy, disarming, and it made my pulse race in a way I hadn't allowed since high school, when I'd buried my truth under layers of denial. "You look like you're carrying the world," Ethan said, his hazel eyes locking onto mine. He was maybe 29, with a jawline sharp enough to cut through my resolve and a confidence that felt like it could rewrite my story. I muttered something about work stress, but his hand grazed my arm, and I froze. The touch was electric, reckless, and it stirred something I'd sworn to keep locked away. I should have pulled back. I should have left. But I didn't. The pool bar was alive with the hum of vacationers' families splashing in the water, couples whispering under cabanas, but in that moment, it was just us. Ethan's fingers lingered, then slid down to my thigh, slow and deliberate, as if testing the waters of my resistance. My breath caught, and I hated how much I didn't want him to stop. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, like he knew the war raging inside me. I wasn't okay. I was terrified, and I was alive. I grew up in a small Illinois town where different was a dirty word. My father, a pastor, preached love but practiced judgment. My mother's silence was her agreement. I learned early to hide who I was, to smile through the sermons that called people like me an abomination. I dated girls, played football, and built a life that looked perfect from the outside. But inside, I was suffocating. At 18, I left for Chicago, promising myself I'd never look back. Yet here I was, 10 years later, still running from the truth. Ethan wasn't running. He wore his identity like a second skin open, unashamed. He told me he was a photographer, traveling the world to capture moments of raw humanity. "People are most beautiful when they're real," he said, his hand still on my thigh, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. I wanted to be real. I wanted to be seen. But the weight of my past clung to me, whispering that whatever this was couldn't last. We talked for hours as the sun dipped below the horizon, the pool lights casting a soft glow. He shared stories of his travels, of falling in love in Paris and heartbreak in Tokyo. I told him about my designs, my late-night sketches, but not about the nights I lay awake, wrestling with who I was. His hand stayed on my thigh, a quiet anchor, and I let it. For the first time, I let myself feel the pull of possibility. But possibility was dangerous. My family was expecting me back in Chicago for my sister's wedding in a week. They didn't know I was here, avoiding their calls, avoiding the inevitable questions about when I'd settled down. Ethan didn't know any of this, but his touch felt like it could unravel the lies I'd told myself for years. As the bar emptied, he leaned closer, his lips brushing my ear. "Come with me tomorrow," he whispered. "I'm shooting at the beach. Let me show you something real." I wanted to say yes. Every fiber of me screamed to follow him, to chase this feeling. But the voice in my head, the one that sounded like my father, reminded me of the cost. I pulled back, my hand trembling as I pushed his away. "I can't," I said, my voice barely audible. Ethan's eyes searched mine, not with anger, but with something worse, understanding. He nodded, paid for our drinks, and left me sitting there, the warmth of his touch lingering like a ghost. That night, I lay in my hotel bed, staring at the ceiling. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of what I'd just walked away from. I'd spent my life running from myself, but Ethan's hand on my thigh had felt like a map to somewhere new, somewhere I was too afraid to go. Tomorrow, I'd see him again. I knew it, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to keep saying no. The morning sun was relentless, glinting off the ocean as I stood at the edge of the resort's private beach. I hadn't slept. Ethan's invitation echoed in my mind, a siren call I couldn't shake. I told myself I was just here to clear my head, to sketch the waves in my notebook. But my eyes kept scanning the shoreline for him. And then I saw him, camera in hand, crouching near a cluster of driftwood, his focus intense. Ethan was a magnet, and I was helpless against his pull. I approached, my sandals sinking into the sand, my heart hammering louder than the waves. He looked up, and his smile was like a sunrise, warm and disarming. "You came," he said, standing to meet me. His voice held no judgment, only a quiet joy that made my chest ache. I mumbled something about needing inspiration for a project, but we both knew it was a lie. I was here for him. He handed me a spare camera, a sleek Nikon that felt foreign in my hands. "Point and shoot," he said, guiding me toward a weathered pier where seagulls circled. His fingers brushed mine as he adjusted my grip, and I flinched not from discomfort, but from the intensity of wanting more. We spent the morning photographing the beach, the way the light danced on the water, the footprints of strangers etched in the sand, the fleeting moments that felt eternal through his lens. Ethan talked as we worked, his voice weaving stories of the places he'd been. He spoke of a Moroccan market where he'd captured a vendor's pride in his woven rugs, of a New Orleans jazz funeral that had moved him to tears. "It's not about the shot," he said, pausing to frame a wave crashing against the pier. "It's about what the shot says about who we are." I wanted to ask what my presence here said about me, but I was too afraid of the answer. By noon, the heat was unbearable, and we retreated to a shaded cafe nearby. Over iced coffee, he asked about my life in Chicago. I told him about my studio apartment, my freelance gigs, the way I lost myself in my art. But I didn't mention the family I distanced myself from, or the nights I spent wondering if I'd ever be enough. His eyes held mine, steady and searching, and I felt exposed in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Let's go somewhere," he said suddenly, his hand resting on the table, inches from mine. "Tonight, there's a jazz club in South Beach. No pressure, just music and us." His words were casual, but his gaze was anything but. I wanted to say yes, to lose myself in the rhythm of a night with him. But the weight of my past pressed down. My sister's wedding loomed, a reminder of the life I was supposed to live. I hesitated, and his smile faltered, just for a moment. "I'll think about it," I said, hating the cowardice in my voice. Ethan nodded, but I could see the question in his eyes. "What are you so afraid of?" I didn't have an answer, not one I could say out loud. That afternoon, I returned to my room and pulled out my sketchbook, trying to capture the curve of Ethan's jaw, the intensity of his gaze. Each stroke felt like a confession, a step closer to admitting what I'd spent years denying. My phone buzzed a text from my sister, Emily, asking if I'd booked my flight for the wedding. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. I hadn't told her I was in Miami. I hadn't told her anything real in years. The jazz club was a bad idea. I knew it. But as the sun set, I found myself in the hotel mirror, adjusting my collar, my hands shaking. I was tired of running, tired of hiding. Ethan was offering me a glimpse of something honest, something I'd never allowed myself to want. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The club was a haze of neon and smoke, the music a pulse that thrummed through my bones. Ethan was waiting outside, his white shirt unbuttoned just enough to make my mouth dry. He grinned when he saw me, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "You look good," he said, his voice low, and I felt the heat of his words settle in my chest. Inside, the band played a slow, soulful tune, and we found a corner table, our knees brushing under the small surface. His hand found mine, tentative at first, then firm, and I didn't pull away. The music wrapped around us, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But as the night wore on, the weight of tomorrow crept back in. I wasn't ready for this to end, but I wasn't ready for it to begin either. The jazz club's dim lights blurred as Ethan's hand tightened around mine, his thumb tracing slow circles on my skin. The music was a heartbeat, steady and urgent, but all I could hear was the question screaming in my head, "What are you doing?" "Caleb." I was falling, fast and hard, into something I'd spent my life avoiding. Ethan leaned closer, his breath warm against my cheek. "Dance with me," he said, not asking but inviting, his eyes daring me to step into the unknown. The dance floor was crowded, bodies swaying to the saxophone's mournful cry, and I wanted to say no, to retreat to the safety of my solitude. But his hand tugged gently, and I followed, my heart a traitor to my fear. We moved together, not quite touching but close enough to feel the heat of him. His confidence anchored me, his hand resting lightly on my waist as we swayed. I wasn't a dancer, but with Ethan, it didn't matter. He made it feel like we were the only two people in the room, the world shrinking to the space between us. "You're holding back," he whispered, his lips brushing my ear. "Let go, Caleb. Just for tonight." I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But every step felt like a betrayal of the life I'd been taught to live. My father's voice echoed in my mind, his sermons about sin and shame. I saw my mother's face, her quiet disappointment when I'd failed to bring a girlfriend home, and a Millie sister, who loved me but didn't know me. Not really. I was here, dancing with a man who made my blood sing, but I was still tethered to a past I couldn't escape. The song ended, and Ethan led me back to our table, his hand never leaving mine. He ordered another round of drinks, and we talked about art, about dreams, about the places we wanted to see. He spoke of a future where he could live openly, unapologetically, and I envied his certainty. I told him about my sketches, how they were my way of making sense of a world that felt too heavy. But I didn't tell him about the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, ashamed of who I was. As the club emptied, Ethan's gaze grew serious. "What's stopping you?" he asked, his voice cutting through the haze of alcohol and music. I froze, my glass halfway to my lips. "You're here, with me, but you're not here," he said, tapping his chest. "What's holding you back?" I wanted to tell him everything: the fear, the guilt, the years of hiding. But the words stuck in my throat, and I looked away. He didn't push. Instead, he stood, offering his hand. "Walk with me," he said. We left the club, the Miami night warm and heavy with salt air. The streets of South Beach buzzed with life. But Ethan led me toward the ocean, where the noise faded and the waves took over. We sat on the sand, our shoulders touching, and he told me about his first love, a boy in high school who'd broken his heart but taught him to be fearless. "I decided then," he said, "that I'd never hide again. Not for anyone. I wanted that courage. I wanted to be the man who could sit here, under the stars, and not feel like a fraud." But my phone buzzed in my pocket, a reminder of the world waiting for me. Another text from Emily, Caleb, please call. We need to talk about the wedding. I silenced it, but the guilt was louder. Ethan noticed, his eyes narrowing. Family? He asked. I nodded, my throat tight. They don't know, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. They don't know who I am. Ethan's hand found mine, squeezing gently. Then tell them, he said, as if it were that simple. But it wasn't. Telling them meant risking everything, me family, my place in their world, the fragile peace I'd built. We sat in silence, the waves crashing in rhythm with my thoughts. Ethan's hand was warm, steady, a lifeline I wasn't sure I deserved. I'm not asking you to change your life, he said finally. But I see you, Caleb, and I think you're worth seeing. His words cracked something open inside me, and I turned to him, my lips parting to speak. But no words came. Instead, I leaned in, and he met me halfway. The kiss was tentative at first, then desperate, a collision of fear and longing. His hands cupped my face, and for a moment, I was free from the shame, the lies, the weight of who I was supposed to be. But as we pulled apart, the reality of tomorrow crashed back in. I had a choice to make, and I wasn't sure I was brave enough to make it. The taste of Ethan lingered on my lips as we walked back to the resort, the Miami night wrapping us in its humid embrace. His hand brushed mine, and I didn't pull away, but my mind was a battlefield. That kiss had been a revelation, a door flung open to a world I'd only dreamed of, but it also felt like a betrayal of everything I'd been taught to believe. Back at the hotel, Ethan paused outside my room, his eyes searching mine. Come in, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't an invitation I'd planned, but the words slipped out, driven by a need I couldn't name. He followed me inside, the door clicking shut like a decision made. The room was dark, save for the moonlight spilling through the window, and we stood there, inches apart, the air thick with unspoken questions. Caleb, he said, his voice soft but steady. You don't have to do this. Not if you're not ready. But I was tired of not being ready. Tired of living half a life. I stepped closer, my hands finding his chest, and kissed him again. This time, there was no hesitation, only heat and hunger. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me into him. And for the first time, I let myself fall without fear. We didn't sleep. We talked, our bodies tangled in the sheets, the space between us erased. He told me about his coming out, how his parents had embraced him, how he'd built a life where he could be himself. I envied that freedom, but I also felt it seeping into me, like his courage was contagious. I told him about my childhood, the sermons, the suffocating expectations. He listened, his fingers tracing patterns on my back, and I felt seen in a way I never had. Morning came too soon, the sunlight harsh against the intimacy of the night. Ethan was still asleep, his face peaceful, and I watched him, my heart aching with the weight of what this meant. I wasn't the same man who'd sat at the pool bar 2 days ago, but I also wasn't free not yet. My phone buzzed again, Emily's name flashing on the screen. I ignored it, but the guilt was a knife in my gut. We spent the day together, exploring Miami's art district. Ethan's camera captured murals and street performers, but his eyes kept finding me, like I was the real subject. At a small gallery, he showed me a photo he'd taken of me on the beach, me face unguarded, my smile genuine. This is you, he said, pointing at the image. Not the guy you think you have to be. I wanted to believe him, but the weight of my family's expectations was a shadow I couldn't shake. That evening, we sat at a rooftop bar, the city skyline glittering below. Ethan's hand rested on my knee, a quiet claim, and I let it stay. But my phone kept buzzing Emily. Again, her messages growing more urgent. Caleb, where are you? Dad's asking. Please call. I turned the phone face down, but Ethan noticed. You can't keep running, he said gently. Not from them. Not from yourself. He was right, but the thought of facing my family off telling them who I was made my chest tighten. They'll hate me, I said, my voice breaking. Ethan's hand squeezed mine. They might, but you'll survive it. And you'll be free. His words were a lifeline, but I wasn't sure I could grab it. We returned to the resort, and Ethan kissed me under the palm trees. The stars above us a silent witness. Stay with me, he said, not just for the night, but for something bigger. I wanted to say yes, to build a life where I could be this version of myself, open, unafraid. But the wedding was in 3 days, and I hadn't even bought my plane ticket. I hadn't told Ethan about it either, and the omission felt like a lie. That night, as we lay together, I made a decision. I'd go to the wedding. I'd face my family, but I wouldn't do it alone. I turned to Ethan, his breathing steady beside me, and whispered, "Come with me." His eyes opened, surprise flickering across his face. To Chicago? He asked. I nodded, my heart pounding. I want them to meet you. I want them to see me. It was a reckless plan, born of desperation and hope. Ethan didn't say yes right away. He studied me, his hand brushing my cheek. You sure? He asked. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway, because for the first time, I wanted to be sure. I wanted to be the man Ethan saw in that photograph, not the one hiding in the shadows. The plane to Chicago felt like a descent into judgment, each mile pulling me closer to a reckoning I wasn't ready for. Ethan sat beside me, his hand resting on the armrest, close but not touching, a quiet reminder of his presence. I'd asked him to come, but now, staring at the clouds outside the window, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. We landed at O'Hare, the cold air a shock after Miami's warmth. Ethan's easy confidence seemed out of place in the gray sprawl of the city, but his smile was steady as he grabbed our bags. You're not alone in this, he said, sensing my tension. I nodded, but my stomach churned. I hadn't told my family he was coming. I hadn't told them anything. We checked into a hotel downtown, avoiding my parents' house in the suburbs. I needed space to breathe, to figure out how to say the words I'd never spoken aloud. Ethan didn't push, but his presence was a challenge, to be honest, to be brave. That night, we walked along the Chicago River, the city lights reflecting on the water. Tell me about them, he said, his voice gentle but firm. I told him about my father, whose sermons had shaped my shame, my mother, whose silence had cut deeper than words, and Emily, who loved me but lived in the same cage of expectations. They think I'm someone I'm not, I said, my voice raw. Ethan stopped walking, turning to face me. Then show them who you are, he said, his hands on my shoulders. You're enough, Caleb. You always have been. The next morning, I called Emily. Her voice was warm but edged with worry. Where have you been? Dad's been asking about you. I told her I was in town, that I needed to talk. Can I bring someone? I asked, my heart in my throat. There was a pause. Then, of course, I didn't tell her who Ethan was. I wasn't ready for that conversation over the phone. We drove to the suburbs, the familiar streets tightening the knot in my chest. Ethan was quiet, letting me lead, but his hand found mine as we pulled into my parents' driveway. The house looked the same: white picket fence, manicured lawn, a monument to normalcy. Emily opened the door, her smile faltering when she saw Ethan. Caleb, she said, her eyes darting between us. Who's this? Ethan, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He's important to me. Her eyes widened. But she didn't ask questions. Just let us inside. My parents were in the living room. My father's Bible open on the coffee table. My mother arranging flowers for the wedding. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Dad. Mom. I said, my voice shaking now. This is Ethan. He's my... I faltered. The word boyfriend caught in my throat. Ethan's hand squeezed mine, giving me strength. He's my partner. I said, the word foreign but right. My father's face hardened. My mother's hands froze on the flowers. Emily's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The silence was deafening. Then my father stood, his voice low and cold. Caleb, what is this? I'd prepared for anger, for judgment, but the disappointment in his eyes cut deeper. I started to explain, to tell them about Miami, about Ethan, about the man I'd been hiding. But the words tumbled out in fragments, raw and unpolished. Ethan stood beside me, his presence a shield, but I could feel the fracture forming in my family. My mother spoke first, her voice trembling. We raised you better than this. The words were a slap, but I didn't flinch. You raised me to be honest. I said, this is me being honest. My father turned away, his shoulders rigid, and I knew I'd lost him, at least for now. Emily stepped forward, her eyes wet. Caleb, I don't understand, but I love you. It wasn't acceptance, but it was a start. We left the house, the weight of the conversation lingering like smoke. Ethan held my hand as we drove back to the city, his silence giving me space to process. You did it, he said finally, his voice soft. You were brave, but I didn't feel brave. I felt raw, exposed, like I'd torn down a wall only to find a storm waiting. The wedding was tomorrow, and I wasn't sure I could face it. But Ethan's hand in mine was a reminder that I wasn't alone. For the first time, I'd chosen myself, and that was enough for now. The morning of Emily's wedding dawned gray and heavy, the Chicago sky mirroring the storm in my chest. I stood in our hotel room, staring at the suit I'd laid out, the tie and noose I wasn't sure I could wear. Ethan sat on the bed, watching me with quiet patience. You don't have to go, he said, his voice steady. But I did. Not for them, but for me. We drove to the church, the same one where my father had preached my entire childhood. The steeple loomed like a judgment, and my hands shook as I parked. Ethan reached for me, his touch grounding. You're not that kid anymore, he said. You're you. And that's enough. His words were a lifeline, but the fear still clawed at me. Inside, the church was alive with flowers and music, guests milling in their Sunday best. Emily spotted me from across the room, her white dress glowing, and she rushed over, her smile tentative. You came, she said, her eyes flickering to Ethan. I introduced him again, this time with more confidence. He's with me, I said, and her nod was small but real. My parents were at the front, my father in his pastor's robe, my mother stiff beside him. I felt their eyes on me as I took a seat near the back, Ethan's hand brushing mine. The ceremony was beautiful, Emily radiant as she vowed to love her husband forever. But I couldn't focus. My father's gaze kept finding me, heavy with unspoken words. After the vows, at the reception, I braced myself. My father approached, his face unreadable. Caleb, he said, his voice low. We need to talk. Ethan squeezed my hand, then stepped away, giving us space. My father led me to a quiet corner, the music fading behind us. What you said yesterday, he began. It's not what we believe. I waited for the sermon, the condemnation, But instead, he looked tired, almost broken. "I don't understand it," he said. "But you're my son." It wasn't acceptance, but it was a crack in the wall. I told him about Ethan, about how he made me feel alive, how I'd spent years hiding to protect them. "I'm done hiding," I said, my voice steady now. He didn't respond, just nodded and walked away. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was a start. The reception continued, and Ethan pulled me onto the dance floor, his arms around me as we swayed to a slow song. My mother watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. But Emily joined us, her smile brighter now. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, hugging me tight. For the first time, I felt like I belonged in my own skin. We left the reception early, the weight of the day lifting as we stepped into the cool night air. Ethan drove us to Lake Michigan, the water dark and endless under the stars. We sat on the shore, his arm around me, and I let myself breathe. "I love you," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Ethan's eyes widened, then softened, and he kissed me, slow and deep. "I love you too," he said, and the world felt right. But the future was still uncertain. Ethan's life was on the road, his photography pulling him to new horizons. Mine was here, in Chicago, or maybe somewhere new, somewhere I could be myself. We talked about it as the waves crashed, about what it meant to build a life together. It wouldn't be easy. My family's acceptance was fragile, and I had years of fear to unlearn. But with Ethan beside me, it felt possible. We returned to the hotel, our hands intertwined, and I knew this was only the beginning. I'd faced my family, faced myself, and come out stronger. Ethan's love was a mirror, showing me who I could be. And for the first time, I believed I could be that man. The days after the wedding blurred together, a mix of hope and uncertainty. Ethan and I stayed in Chicago, navigating the fragile new reality I'd created. My father's words, "You're my son," echoed in my mind. A small bridge over a chasm of difference. But bridges could crumble, and I wasn't sure how to keep this one standing. We spent mornings in my studio apartment, Ethan's camera capturing the city's grit and beauty while I sketched him in stolen moments. His presence filled the space, making it feel like home in a way it never had. But the question of what came next hung over us. His next assignment was in Lisbon, a month-long project starting in a week. "Come with me," he said one evening, his voice casual but his eyes serious. The idea was intoxicating. A new country, a new life, but it meant leaving everything behind. I called Emily, needing her perspective. We met at a coffee shop, her wedding ring glinting as she stirred her latte. "I'm trying to understand," she said, her voice soft. "I want you to be happy, Caleb, but it's a lot." I told her about Ethan, about how he made me feel whole. She listened, her eyes wet, and when she hugged me goodbye, she whispered, "Be you," whatever that means. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was love, and that was enough for now. My parents were harder. I visited them alone, Ethan's absence a concession to their discomfort. My mother made tea, her hands nervous, while my father sat in silence. "We're trying," she said finally, "but it's not easy." I nodded, knowing their love was tangled in their beliefs. I didn't ask for more than they could give, but I left with a promise to keep talking, to keep showing them who I was. Ethan and I spent our last days in Chicago exploring, our hands intertwined as we walked through Millennium Park. The beam reflected our silhouettes, distorted but together, and I felt a surge of hope. But the night before his flight, reality crashed in. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice breaking as we lay in bed. "You're leaving, and I'm here." Ethan's hand found mine, his thumb tracing familiar circles. We'll figure it out. He said, love doesn't need a map. But I needed one. I needed to know how to build a life where I could be myself without losing everything. The next morning, I drove him to the airport. The silence heavy. At the gate, he kissed me, his hands cupping my face. I'll call you from Lisbon, he said, and you'll come when you're ready. I nodded, but as he walked away, I felt the distance growing already. Back in my apartment, the emptiness was suffocating. I opened my sketchbook, Ethan's face staring back from every page. I'd spent years hiding, but he'd shown me what it meant to live. I picked up my phone and booked a one-way ticket to Lisbon. It was reckless, terrifying, but it was also right. I wasn't running away this time, it was running towards something. Lisbon was a kaleidoscope of color and sound, its cobblestone streets alive with history and possibility. I landed with a single suitcase and a heart full of hope. Ethan waiting for me at the airport. His smile was brighter than the Portuguese sun, and when he pulled me into his arms, I knew I'd made the right choice. You're here, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm here, I echoed, and for the first time, I believed it. We rented a small apartment overlooking the Tagus River, its waters reflecting the city's golden light. Ethan's photography project kept him busy, but we carved out moments together, mornings sipping coffee on our balcony, evenings wandering through Alfama's narrow alleys. I found freelance work, my designs taking on a new vibrancy inspired by this city, by Ethan, by the man I was becoming. But the past wasn't gone. I called Emily weekly, her voice a tether to home. She told me about my parents, how they were grappling with my truth. Dad asked about you, she said one day. He didn't say much, but he asked. It was small, but it was progress. I sent them a photo of Ethan and me at a Lisbon market, my arm around him, my smile unforced. They didn't reply, but they didn't reject it either. Ethan's love was a constant, a warmth that grounded me. We fought sometimes about my hesitation to share our life online, about his tendency to leap without looking, but we always came back to each other. One night, under a sky full of stars, he proposed, not with a ring, but with a photograph he'd taken of us in Miami. That first day by the pool. This is where it started, he said, his voice steady. And I wanted to go on forever. I said yes, my heart full. But the decision wasn't without fear. Marriage meant visibility, a public declaration of who I was. I thought of my parents, of the church, of the life I'd left behind. But I also thought of Ethan's hand on my thigh, of the moment I'd chosen to feel instead of hide. I was done running. We married in a small ceremony by the river, Emily flying in to stand beside me. My parents didn't come, but they sent a letter. Their words cautious but kind. We're praying for you, they wrote. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. The ceremony was simple, just us and a few friends. The sunset painting the sky in hues of love and hope. Years later, I look back on that pool bar in Miami, on the moment Ethan's hand slid down my thigh. It was a spark, a beginning, a choice to live authentically. We built a life in Lisbon, then Paris, then New York. Ethan's camera capturing our journey, my sketches telling our story. My family never fully embraced us, but they learned to love me in their way, and I learned to love myself in mine. Ethan sits beside me now, his hand on my thigh, a familiar anchor. We're older, our hair streaked with gray, but his touch still makes my heart race. I was afraid once, of him, of myself, of the world. But love, I've learned, is braver than fear. And every day, I choose it.